I will be your professor and teacher for this semester. Here is the crew of teaching assistants. Our head TA is Sergio Barreto, who is also a cameraman on the top. So if you have any issues on the website, on Moodle, everything, go to him. And then we have Andre Bernstein, who has a doctor appointment this morning. Mashod, Tek Tsegai, and Tsong Wang. We will also have Miroslav Popovic, who is finishing his PhD, should not be a TA, but given that we are many students, he will also help during the sessions. This course is a master course. It's a master course. That means we will go at some depth into the topic. It requires some work. It's not an easy course in volume, but the requirements are also simple. You need essentially to be happy with a computer, which means you should not be reluctant to spend hours typing commands. But there is no prior knowledge of either TCP-IP other than everybody's knowledge or any specific system knowledge of any kind. Of course, the more you know, the more fruitful it will be to you, but there is no requirement. We'll practice with computers in a virtual environment, so we will use virtual machines and virtual networks in your own computer, so you will need your own computer, and we will discuss more of that for the lab that starts next week. It's a preparation for all kinds of things that need networking. Sometimes there is an advanced networking course at EPFL on things like peer-to-peer system, distributed networks. It's a requirement for courses like smart grid and information systems. Don't hesitate to interrupt me anytime if there are things that are unclear. A challenge when teaching such a course is how to go into the details. In fact, if you have, for example, to install an ADSL modem at home and you know nothing of TCP/IP, you can still install it. If you get a Swisscom thing, you just press a button. If you got a Sunrise thing, it's a bit more sophisticated. You will need to read the user guide, and at the end, hopefully it will work. So in some sense, we don't need such a course. Or is the goal of such a course to be able to install, debug, understand, develop any type of networking equipment? The answer is yes, but we will not directly teach all the necessary things you need to do for each of those practical purposes, for several reasons. One, it's not feasible. There's simply too many details everywhere. Second, it's not interesting. 90% of those details are just anecdotal or accidental. You have to do this thing in this way because that's the way it's programmed to be done. Someone else who would have written it would do it in a different way. For example, on a Macintosh or a Unix system versus on Windows, when you type some things, some commands, they are different. There's no hard science why they would be different. So it cannot be the goal to have to learn everything and be operational on everything. However, we will teach you what are the fundamental principles. So what are the leading ideas that are behind all those mountain of details that is TCP/IP and the internet and all networked systems today. However, knowing the fundamentals means having a solid, wide foundation is necessary to be able to truly understand what happens, as opposed to just try and errors until it works, but truly understand to guide you where to go. Versus, but it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient because the details sometimes are important. So if you just know the theory, you know what's the performance of TCP, but you've never done something practical with the computer, that theory will be completely useless. So there is a challenge, there's a dilemma. Should we go deep in every topic, and should we go broadly? If you want to do that, you'll take a 2-year full master's on TCP/IP. And for some people it's important if you want to work at Cisco or in some other companies. But for us, that's not the goal. So instead, we will use what we call the rake method or the rake philosophy. A rake is this red thing here that you use in autumn to collect the leaves in gardens. Right? We will go, this is the fundamentals that we will teach, and then we will go deeply in a set of carefully selected topics. That will be the labs that you will do. And the hope, or our experience, is that you should trust us that we have picked a number of well-chosen selected topics such that with a high probability, anything you will do in the next 30 years will fall in the convex sets of this. So perhaps you'll need to study something very detailed, but it will be here. Having done this, then you will be able to catch that leaf with the rake, or you will be able to have an idea of how things should be even before looking at them in detail. As we will see, we will test that. In what is called the research exercise. Another way to put it is we will study the theories that are very shallow. It's not like in information theory or communication theory. The theory is very shallow. It's more principles of good organization of complex systems rather than anything else. But we will illustrate the theory on examples. Now, if people are confronted with computers, I mean, if your neighbor comes and calls you and says, oh, it doesn't work, my application doesn't, and you come to that neighbor to try to help him, you're taking a high risk. In 95% of the cases, it will be a trivial, stupid thing, and by rebooting or removing or renaming a file or downloading a new version, it will work. In the remaining 5% of the cases, it will be very difficult. But what is difficult in TCP-IP is the implementation and the variance of implementation and the inconsistent implementations, things that should work and don't work. So that will be a recurrent theme in the labs. You will try things, they won't work. Sometimes they will not work because you did the thing wrong. Sometimes they will not work because there are bugs in the software or the software is not complete. And having to learn how to sort out between the two things is what those labs will train you to do. However, the good news is that most of the underlying principles of TCP/IP are very old and haven't changed. TCP and IP were defined in 1974. The first routers was built a bit before with a variant that was a bit different. But since it has been done in 1974, there has been only anecdotal change with one major change, which is the introduction of congestion control that we will discuss in detail. Later, the invention of new application layer protocol, the most famous of which is HTTP, which was invented in 92. But since then, essentially, there is Web 2.0, HTTP2 versus HTTP1, but there are adding details that are very important if you're coding an application, but that don't really impact the network itself and the fundamentals of TCP/IP. In fact, this is a field that is extremely conservative, in fact, too conservative, and we will see that this is a problem. We will discover and talk at length of IPv4 versus IPv6. There's a new version of the numbering plan of the internet that was started in the 90s, so 25 years ago, and still has a hard time being implemented. So it's very hard to change things, in fact, in the internet, which is good news. I mean, it's a good investment to learn about the principles. All the principles that you will have learned will survive probably much longer than me. When doing so, it's important to make the difference. I mean, this is trivial and applies to anything you do in science or technology, but it's worth repeating it. It's important to make the difference between why and what on one hand versus how. If you want to do something like install some piece of software, then usually it's very clumsy, very complicated, and it can be very difficult to do. And most of the time it's difficult to do because the people who are writing the guides for how to install that software, they don't tell you what you are doing. They just say, click here, click that, click that. 90% of the things that they tell you to do, you would know how to do them just without instructions. Move a file here, okay, you know how to do that. But a few things are important, and is what is happening, what are we doing here? Are we installing a certificate? What is a certificate? Why do we need a certificate if we talk about security, for example? Are we installing a routing table entry? Then why do we need a routing table entry? What's the purpose? Then how you do it in a given system, of course, may take you a large number of steps. But we will try to always make the difference between the two. It's very important for any protocol that we will study, for any function that we will study, to remember the what and the why. Even beyond, I would say, once you understand the what this thing is doing, you can try to guess how it is doing it, or what you should do to install it. And most of the time, your guess will be right. And for the few times that your guess will not be right, then you can learn the difference. That's the only thing you need to remember. That's a way to compress those mountains of information that go around TCP-IP. The course is structured in lectures now, every week at this time in this room. Every week also there is a lab. Every lab we'll talk more, is in principle 2 weeks, except the first lab tomorrow, which is a shorter lab to get the fundamental things in place very quickly. The room for the lab is INF1 with an overflow room INF2. You need your own computer, bring your own computer. In the past years, we often had, at the beginning of the course, the need for an additional slot, depending on your background. If you come from computer science, you probably don't need it. If you come from another field, you might need more time to do the installation with Linux, for example, although we give you all the instructions to do, but if it's your first time, it obviously may take a bit more time. So for this, we give a second slot, which is this one, which is not an official slot. It's a pirate lab that is in INF 019, which is the Internet Engineering Workshop. In the past years, we did most of the labs in a special room with special routers and computers. Fortunately, and this has space for 60 people. Fortunately, today we can work on virtual environments. We will use this lab if, for example, you're stuck, your computer is dead, or you don't have a way to install virtual machines. You will be able to go to that room. We will give support in this time slot. This is on Friday, and this is on Tuesday. I guess the most important information is...
First lab session is from 11 to 13. Professor, the first lab session is 11 to 1.
Okay. Let's retry. Pen. Okay. So to 1, this is Friday, and this is Tuesday. Of course, all of this is on Moodle. You don't need to know the slides for that. Now, the bad news is that plus the labs, there is also this little thing, which is a test. When I was a young professor, many, many years ago, I believed all students were like me. They would take the thing seriously, and they would work every week. And at the end, we had 30% failure rate at the final exam. So I learned from that, and we do tests every other week to force you to be synchronized with the course. I know it's a bit pity, but it works. Since we do that, the failure rate at the exam is minuscule. And the exams are the same. They're not easier or more difficult. So we will do every other week, starting week 3. We'll do a quiz. In the past years, it was done with clickers, but now you're too many. It's too clumsy to do with clickers. We will do it on paper. So multiple choice questionnaire on paper. We'll have 10 questions that cover the past weeks of the course. We try to alternate. When you have a lab report to return, you will not have a quiz on that week. That's why we start on week 3 only, because you will have a lab to return. The lab that you do this week, you will have to return on week 2, next week. There'll be a final exam, which is a theoretical exam. Both for the test and the final exam, you have on Moodle examples of the past years with corrections for the final exams. For this one, those are online tests. You can take them, and you will get the answers when you have submitted them. In addition, there is a research exercise that I will describe in a few minutes in more detail. The goal is optional. The goal of the research exercise is try to practice what I hope works, the rake philosophy. We've studied a number of topics in the course. Then we take one topic that we have not studied, and we ask you to study it and make a small implementation to test it, make a written report. We ask you a few quiz questions on that without giving you a lecture. And the best reports and quiz questions will get the right to do a presentation, the last session of the semester, to the rest of the class. So those who did not take the research exercise can benefit by learning from the course that will be given by the students. We will loosely follow the following textbook by Olivier Bonaventure, and other people have contributed to it. That's an open textbook. It contains many, many details, but it follows more or less the same philosophy that I'm following in this course. It's the only book that does that. So you can find it's free. You can find it in PDF, in EPUB format. Unfortunately, there are two versions. Some things are better explained in edition 1 than in edition 2, so you don't have to live with it. But it's very, very readable, very easy to read. So if you have any compliments you would like to have in addition to the slides, or if you have any things you would like to go deeper or is poorly explained in the slides, then you can go to this textbook. For congestion control, this textbook is not very, very oriented towards that, so it doesn't explain it really. So I wrote a little lecture, a small set of lecture notes that are on the website of the course or on at this URL. You are in principle automatically registered on the Moodle site if you registered in the academic service for this course. If that doesn't happen for whatever reason, please inform Sergio, who will enroll you. The labs will be explained a bit later by Sergio. I mentioned the tests. Just to recap here, the tests are 0 documents, 0 nothing, not an iPhone, not a smartphone, not a calculator, nothing. We will enforce that very strictly. Call it the clean desk policy during the test, which will be in INF and INF2. At the first 15 minutes of the lab session, you will have no equipment authorized, of course. The best 5, there will be 7 tests in total. Yes. And the best 5 are used for grading. So if you're sick or you go to military service for 1 week, okay, then that serves you as a joker for that. Voilà, we will use clickers for more fun in class. So if you have a clicker, that will be easier, the performance will be better. If you don't have one, you can borrow one from AGPoly. If you don't want to borrow, you can try to go to this website, rwpol.com, open a browser, go there, and in principle, you should not have to log in, not sign in, and you should give simply the session number, which will change every time I start my computer, and it should work, but it does not always work.
There is no space between the first 3 and the second 3 digits.
Okay. There is no space here. It's a 6-digit session number. So as a test, I'm asking you 3 questions. So right now, when you open your browser and you give the answer, you go to a server of RWPol, which is Turning Point Technology, which is, I guess, in the US. And then when you give your answer, it goes to that server. My computer is also connected to that server, and I get the answers back here. There is a non-negligible round-trip time. And there is another issue, which might be the throughput of the wireless access LAN in this room, that if you all together click at the same time, it might also cause some delay. If you have a clicker, does anybody have a clicker? Yes. Does it work? Not yet. Should work. It's connected here. No? It doesn't work. You should be on channel 41. And it worked? Okay, let's see the result of your poll. So 2/3 of you had already a computer networking course. I hope you didn't come in because you think it's an easy credit to obtain because you did it already. Principle should not be. The bachelor course covers computer networking from a slightly different viewpoint. There is a bit of overlap, but we will go very, very quickly on the overlapping parts. The final exam is also closed book, so you have no book, no material, no nothing. When I was a young professor, again, I had complete illusions about the model of the student, so it was also open book. You could have a book. And believe it or not, the results were much less good with a book than without a book. I guess because of the strategy that consists saying, this I don't need to know because it's in the book. That's wrong. Everything is in Wikipedia, so if you go by this, you don't need to take any course. You'll find everything in Wikipedia. But some of the things need to be in your head. Of course, not everything. So we have posted on the website the exam booklet, which is something that we will print and give you the day of the exam. So you can know already now what you don't need to know. Things like what is the header of an IP packet, how many bits is the sequence number in TCP, things like this. If ever it's useful for the exam, you don't need, of course, to know that by heart. I mentioned the research exercise. So here's the mechanic of it. We will post in 5 weeks a topic. It will be on this topic mentioned here. Then you will hand in 2 weeks later a report. 2-3 weeks later, you will have to do a few experiments that will be graded. And the grade, because this is done in the conditions of a lab, something you will do at home or in your computer, it comes as a bonus to the lab. The bonus rules are if you get 4 out of 6, you have 0 bonus. Makes sense? And if you get 6 out of 6, you have the maximum bonus, which is 0.25. Seems little, but that's a lot on an average. Then after that, for those who still want to continue, it's all voluntary. You will take a test similar to the test we will do every other week, or a bit different depending on what we will do by then. And similarly, this will be graded, and the grade will be added to the theory grade, so to the exam and test grade here. And the 2 best results at this will be allowed to give a talk at the class, as I mentioned, and they have the opportunity to present that to class. This is an exercise of things that you very often will have to do if you work in this field. If you work in a company and you're asked to do some topic, I mean, should we move to IPv6 next year? And then you don't know anything of IPv6, of course that will not be the case for you. Then you need to learn by yourself what that thing is and to give a report perhaps to your management or to your colleagues about what it involves, what should be done. So this is exactly how you should think of the research exercise. Last, the goal of all this is not to obtain a grade, but it's also an interesting byproduct of this course. So there is theory and practice. Both are important. That's the rake philosophy. I mean, if you know just the theory of TCP/IP but never practiced anything, probably it doesn't mean anything. In fact, the practice is probably more important because the theory is not very, very deep and very complicated. However, for grading purposes, the theory and the practice will have the same value, because the lab, the practice part is of course much more difficult to assure authenticity. The theory grade is made of the test. I wrote here clicker. That was the case last year. It's no longer a clicker test. And the exam. And whatever is best, if the exam is best, then that's the final grade. If your grade at the test is better than your exam grade, then it will be a weight of 40%. If you have a research exercise test bonus, it will be added there. The lab is, the lab grade, the practice grade is the average of all the labs. There are 7 labs, but in fact the first lab, called Lab 0, is a smaller one. It's done only this week, so it counts with a weight of 1/2. So this will give you the lab grade, plus if you have research exercise, you will have a bonus. And then the final grade is the mean of those two, theory and lab grade, with equal weights. With a twist, it's the harmonic mean. So if you don't know what harmonic mean means, go to the Moodle site where you will discover that in the page. Essentially, the role of harmonic mean versus the traditional mean is you're unable to recover a catastrophically bad grade somewhere. So if you have a very good grade at the lab and a catastrophically bad grade at the exam, you will get 3.5 instead of 4. So it penalizes a bit more the very bad things, the imbalance between the two. And that's on purpose. It's easy to cheat at the lab. I hope you don't do it, and you should not do it. But we are not naive. We know that the lab grade usually is very good for everyone, which is excellent, but can sometimes lead to counterproductive efforts. So the goal of the lab is to learn a number of things that will be used also for the final exam. So the exam reflects what you've learned at the lab, and we want to avoid that one can make up for the other. Here is the roadmap. We will start today with a very simple and fairly shallow but quick overview of how all things fit together. It may seem a bit weird, but it's very difficult to study during 3 weeks, for example, the MAC layer, and not knowing where it fits with the rest. Also because we cannot do any lab if we just have a very limited view. So we will first go today through a very quick panorama of everything. And then starting next week, we will start digging more on one of the topics. Next week, we will talk of the IP layer. Then we will talk of the, that's starting next week, and the MAC layer, and etc. You have all the topics there. Voila, that's it for this introduction. Any question? Then I'll pass the floor to Sergio, who will give you some information about the lab.